The last time I saw Don Hadley cry, he was sitting in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building he used to own, and his son was the one who handed me the chair at the head of the table. That sentence probably doesn't make sense yet. It will. There was a folder in front of Don. Manila. Nothing fancy. Inside were 11 years of emails, commission restructuring memos he thought I'd never saved, and a resignation letter from his biggest client, addressed not to the company, but to me personally. Don's hands were on the table, palms down, like he was trying to keep the room from spinning. His son Kyle was standing by the window in a suit that still had the tag crease on the sleeve, and he kept looking at me like he was waiting for someone to explain the joke. Nobody was laughing. But this story doesn't start in that conference room. It starts in a Waffle House parking lot in Savannah, Georgia, at 6:15 in the morning, with me eating a pecan waffle in my truck and reading a text message that said, "Kyle will be handling the Ohio Valley accounts moving forward. Let's chat Monday." And the thing about that text, the thing that still sits in my chest like a piece of glass, is that Don sent it on a Saturday. He sent it on a Saturday because he knew I wouldn't make a scene over the weekend. He knew me that well. He knew me that well, and he did it anyway. My name is Marcus Devlin. I'm 36. For 11 years, I was the top producing account manager at Hadley Greer Industrial Supply, a mid-sized distributor operating out of Columbus, Ohio, with satellite offices in Savannah, Louisville, and Charlotte. My territory was the Ohio River Valley Corridor, a stretch of manufacturing towns, paper mills, chemical plants, and warehouse operations that nobody else at the company wanted to touch, because the clients were demanding, the drives were brutal, and the margins were razor thin until you built trust, which took years, which I did. I grew that territory from $380,000 in annual revenue to $2.3 million. I didn't do it by being brilliant. I did it by showing up. By remembering that Gerald Kazmarek at Prestige Fabrication had a daughter with celiac disease, so when I brought donuts to his office, I always grabbed a gluten-free muffin from that bakery on Drayton Street. By knowing that Latonia Brazier at Southern Polymer preferred her invoices sent on Thursdays because that's when her AP clerk processed payments. By sitting in hospital waiting rooms with a client's warehouse manager after a forklift accident and not leaving until the surgeon came out. Relationships. That was the product. Not gaskets and fasteners and PPE. Me. I was the product. My Uncle Clyde, my mother's brother, retired Marine, ran a seafood shack on Tybee Island until his knees gave out. Used to sit on his porch and watch the shrimp boats come in at dusk. I'd visit him every other Sunday after church. He'd drink sweet tea out of a mason jar that said, "World's okayest grandpa," even though he never had kids, and he'd dispense advice like a man who'd earned every syllable. One thing he told me when I was 22 and about to start my first real job: "Marcus, a quiet man in a loud room isn't weak. He's just counting." I didn't understand it then. Thought it was one of those things old men say to sound deep. But I filed it away. And years later, sitting in that Waffle House parking lot with syrup on my thumb and betrayal in my inbox, that sentence came back to me like a bell. I was always a counter. Not math, though I was decent at that too. I mean, I counted things other people didn't notice. How many times a client mentioned a competitor's name? How many days between a promise and a delivery? How many emails Don CC'd me on versus the ones he didn't? I kept a personal spreadsheet on my laptop. Not the company laptop, my own Dell that I bought at Best Buy in 2019 for $647. And in that spreadsheet, I logged every client interaction, every verbal promise made to me by management, every commission adjustment, every reassigned account. Column A was the date. Column B was what was said. Column C was what actually happened. I started that spreadsheet as a habit, an organizing tick, something to do on long drives between client sites when I'd pull over at a rest stop and eat a gas station sandwich and type notes into my phone. I had no idea that spreadsheet would become the most important document in the entire state of Georgia. The other thing about me, and this matters later, so remember it, is that in 2020, during the slow months when COVID gutted our in-person sales, I got my project management professional certification. Just to stay busy. Just to have something on my resume in case things went sideways. Don actually laughed when I told him. Said, "What are you going to manage, Marcus? Your fantasy football team?" Everyone in the office thought it was hilarious. I laughed too. Because that's what I did. I laughed at jokes made at my expense, and I called it being a team player, and I went home and added another row to my spreadsheet. Before I tell you what Don did to me, you need to understand what Don was to me, or what I thought he was. I met Don Hadley when I was 25, interviewing for a junior sales rep position at Hadley Greer. He was 50, silver-haired, barrel-chested, the kind of guy who shook your hand with both of his and looked you dead in the eyes like he was memorizing your face. His office had a framed photo of himself shaking hands with the governor of Ohio. Another frame held a newspaper clipping from the Columbus Dispatch about Hadley Greer's expansion into the southeast. And on his desk, and this detail is burned into my memory, sat a crystal paperweight shaped like a bulldog. Georgia Bulldogs. He'd gone to UGA for 2 years before dropping out, and he never let anyone forget those 2 years. "Marcus," he said in that first interview, leaning back in his leather chair, "I don't hire resumes. I hire hunger. You hungry?" I was. God, I was. I'd been selling cell phone cases at a kiosk in Oglethorpe Mall for 9 months. My apartment was a studio on Victory Drive with a window AC unit that sounded like a lawnmower. I ate rice and canned beans 4 nights a week. And on the 5th night, I'd treat myself to a $6.99 combo from Zaxby's and feel like a king. Don hired me on the spot. He put his hand on my shoulder, heavy, like a father's hand, or what I imagined a father's hand felt like since mine left when I was 7, and said, "Welcome to the family." Family. He used that word a lot. We're all family here. That's what family does. I think of you like a second son, Marcus. And I believed him. For 11 years, I believed a man who used the word family the way other people use breath mints to cover something rotten. The good years were genuinely good, and that's what makes the rest of it so much worse. Don drove me to my first client meeting, taught me how to read a room. Watch their feet, Marcus, not their face. Feet point toward the door. You're losing them. He invited me to his 4th of July cookout in 2015. I met his wife, Gail, who made this pimento cheese dip that was honestly transcendent, and his daughter, Ashlyn, who was in dental school, and his son, Kyle, who was maybe 16 at the time and spent the whole party throwing a tennis ball for their golden retriever. Don promoted me to senior account manager in 2018, gave me a raise from $52,000 to $61,000 base, plus commission. Told me, standing in the break room with a styrofoam cup of coffee in his hand, "When I retire in a few years, Marcus, this territory and this office have your name on them. You've earned it." I should have asked for that in writing. I should have noticed that his eyes slid to the left when he said it. I should have paid attention to the fact that Don promised things the way weather forecasters predict sunshine, confidently, frequently, and with zero accountability when it rained. But I didn't notice. I was too busy being grateful, too busy being the good soldier, too busy being hungry. Here's the first crack. In January 2022, I noticed my commission structure had been quietly adjusted. Not by much, a half-point reduction on accounts under $50,000 annual. I found out not from Don, not from HR, but from a payroll discrepancy I caught because I am, as I mentioned, a counter. I brought it to Don's office. He leaned back in that leather chair and said, "That's above your pay grade, bud. Corporate made the call. Nothing I could do." I said, "Okay." I added a row to my spreadsheet. Column B, corporate decision, nothing he could do. Column C, checked with Renata in payroll. Don submitted the restructuring request himself. Renata Moss, by the way, payroll coordinator, sat in a cubicle near the copier, ate the same turkey and Swiss sandwich every single day, never said much. But when I asked her, casually, the way you ask someone about the weather, who initiated the commission change, she told me the truth without even looking up from her sandwich. Don sent the form in November. Said it like she was reading a bus schedule. I filed that away. Kept smiling. Kept selling. Kept showing up. Then came Kyle. March 2023. Monday all-hands meeting. Fluorescent lights buzzing. Stale donuts from Krispy Kreme on the conference table. The glazed ones were already gone, leaving only the sad cake donuts nobody wants. Don stood at the front of the room in his navy blazer with the brass buttons and announced that his son, Kyle Hadley, 24, fresh graduate of Miami University of Ohio with a marketing degree, would be joining the company as Territory Development Lead. Territory Development Lead. A title that did not exist on Friday. Kyle's got fresh eyes and new energy, Don said, beaming like a man unveiling a statue of himself. I think he's going to bring a lot to the table. Kyle stood next to his father looking exactly like what he was, a 24-year-old who'd spent the last 6 years drinking natural light and playing intramural volleyball. Nice kid, decent handshake, absolutely zero understanding of what a purchase order looked like. I congratulated him personally, brought him a coffee his first week, oat milk latte, because Kyle was the kind of person who drank oat milk lattes in a building full of men who drank Folgers from styrofoam cups. I showed him the CRM system, walked him through the client database, answered his questions, which ranged from reasonable, how do renewal cycles work, to staggering, wait, so the clients pay us? I thought we paid them. I did this because I am, at my core, a people pleaser, because Don asked me to show Kyle the ropes, and I said yes the way I always said yes, and I smiled the way I always smiled, and I went home and added another row to my spreadsheet. 6 weeks later, I logged into Salesforce on a Tuesday morning and noticed that 3 of my top accounts, Prestige Fabrication, Southern Polymer Corp., and Oakhurst Chemical, had been reassigned. The owner field no longer said Marcus Devlin. It said Kyle Hadley. My hands went numb. Not cold. Numb. Like the blood had decided to stop going there. I walked to Don's office. His door was open. He was eating a bag of Chick-fil-A, wiping his fingers on a napkin with the casual ease of a man who has never once questioned whether he deserves what he has. Don, I noticed some of my accounts got moved to Kyle in the system. Just wanted to check. Is that a glitch or... He closed his office door. That was the first time in 11 years Don Hadley closed his door when I was in the room. Marcus, sit down. I sat. Look, Kyle needs to build his book. Down. He's not going to learn if he's starting from scratch. These are established relationships. They'll practically run themselves, and you've got plenty of other accounts to focus on. Those are my 3 biggest clients, Don. That's over $900,000 in annual revenue. It's not your revenue, Marcus. It's the company's revenue. We're all family here. There it was. The word family, deployed like a tourniquet over a wound he'd just inflicted. Don, you told me this territory had my name on it. You said when you retire. I didn't get where I am by complaining, Marcus. He said that. A man who inherited his VP title when his fraternity brother Hank Wexler retired in 2009 and personally recommended Don for the position. That man looked me in the eye and told me he didn't get where he was by complaining. I left his office. I didn't slam the door. I didn't raise my voice. I went to the break room, poured a cup of Folgers into a mug that said, Hadley Greer, Building Partnerships. Since 1987, and I drank it even though it tasted like hot disappointment. And something in me shifted. Not a snap. Not an explosion. More like a gear engaging that had been waiting for its moment. I went home that night and opened my spreadsheet. Scrolled through 11 years of entries. Every promise. Every reassignment. Every commission adjustment. Every time Don said we when he meant you. Every time he took credit in a client meeting. Every time he told me the office would be mine. Then I opened a new tab and started typing something different. Not a record of what had been done to me. A plan for what I was going to do about it. Over the next 2 months, things got worse with the precision of a man who thought he was untouchable. Don reassigned 2 more accounts to Kyle. No conversation this time, just a notification in Salesforce. Beep. Gone. Like my 11 years of relationship building were a file you could just drag and drop. Kyle, to his marginal credit, seemed uncomfortable. He came to my desk one afternoon holding a printed client contact sheet and said, Hey Marcus, I don't really know these people. Can you, introduce me on the calls? Sure, Kyle. Happy to help. I introduced him on 3 calls. On each one, the client asked some version of the same question. So Marcus, You're still going to be our main point of contact, right? And each time, before I could answer, Kyle would jump in with the enthusiasm of a golden retriever who'd learned a new trick. Actually, I'll be taking point on this relationship going forward. Marcus is transitioning to a support role. A support role. I was transitioning to a support role. In a territory I built from a gravel parking lot into a $2.3 million highway. Here's the part that made me laugh, though. Dark, private, gas station parking lot at 11 p.m. laughter. Kyle started trying to wine and dine the clients. He took Gerald Kazmarek from Prestige Fabrication to a steakhouse in downtown Savannah, ordered a $74 Wagyu appetizer. Gerald is a guy who considers Cracker Barrel a fine dining experience, and who once told me he didn't trust any restaurant that didn't have a drive-thru. Kyle spent $340 on that dinner. Gerald called me the next morning and said, "Marcus, what's wrong with this kid? He ordered me steak I couldn't even pronounce." I said nothing. Added it to the spreadsheet. Then came the meeting. The one that lived in my head like a splinter. July 2023. Quarterly review. Don invited the regional leadership team, 7 people, including 2 executives from the parent company who'd flown in from Pittsburgh. The conference room had been cleaned for the occasion. Fresh coffee from the Keurig, not the Folgers. Someone had even put out a fruit tray, which in our office was the equivalent of rolling out a red carpet. Don stood at the front and presented the Ohio River Valley Territory numbers. My numbers. 11 years of my numbers. And he presented them with his hand on Kyle's shoulder. "When we landed the Prestige Fabrication account," Don said, clicking to a slide that showed the revenue growth chart I had personally built in PowerPoint the week before, "it was a turning point for the entire region. And now, with Kyle stepping into a leadership role in that territory, we're seeing fresh energy and new opportunities." Kyle had been in the role for 10 weeks. He had closed exactly 0 new accounts. The fresh energy was a $340 steakhouse receipt and a client who now screened his calls. One of the Pittsburgh executives, a woman named Marguerite Sandoval, raised her hand and asked about client retention metrics. Don turned to me. "Marcus, you want to field that one?" Field that one. Like I was a utility player being brought off the bench, in a game I'd been starting for over a decade. I answered the question, gave the retention numbers, 94.7% over the trailing 12 months. Marguerite wrote something in her notebook. I noticed that. I noticed everything that day. After the meeting, I was in the break room washing my coffee mug, the Hadley Greer mug, because at that point the irony was the only thing keeping me sane, when Don walked in with Kyle. They didn't see me behind the partition. "You did great in there," Don said to Kyle. "These things are all about presence. You've got the Hadley presence." "Thanks, Dad. Just keep letting Marcus do the groundwork. He's good at the grunt stuff. You focus on relationships." Grunt stuff. I was the grunt stuff. Kyle said something I'll never forget. Not because it was cruel, because it was honest in a way that exposed exactly how Don had framed me to his own son. "Dad, are you sure Marcus is cool with all this? He seems kind of, I don't know, quiet." And Don laughed. This big, barrel-chested laugh. The laugh he used to make clients feel comfortable. The laugh he used to fill rooms. "Marcus is always quiet. That's his thing. He's a worker bee, Kyle. Reliable. But he doesn't have the vision for the next level. Never has. Worker bee. 11 years. $2.3 million. Worker bee." I set the mug down on the counter very gently and walked out the side door to the parking lot. Sat in my Honda Accord. Ate a granola bar from my glove compartment. Stared at the building for about 4 minutes. Then I called my Uncle Clyde. "Uncle Clyde, you remember what you told me about the quiet man in the loud room?" "Sure do. I've been counting." He was quiet for a long beat. Then he said, "Good. Now what you gonna do with the numbers?" That was the question. And by then, I already had the answer. See, what nobody at Hadley Greer knew, what Don certainly didn't know, because Don never asked me about my life outside the office, was that I'd been having conversations, not with headhunters, not with lawyers, with the clients themselves. Because here's the thing about a people pleaser who's been building relationships for 11 years. Those relationships don't belong to a Salesforce field. They belong to the person who showed up at 6 a.m. to help unload a delivery truck when the warehouse crew called in sick. The person who drove 4 hours in an ice storm to hand deliver a replacement gasket set because the client's production line was down and every hour cost them $12,000. The person who remembered the gluten-free muffin. I'd started laying groundwork the week after that first Salesforce reassignment. Not aggressively, not obviously. Just conversations. Phone calls I made from my personal cell during lunch breaks, sitting in my Accord in the parking lot of the Panera Bread on Abercorn Street, eating a chicken Caesar salad. Gerald, if I were ever to move to a different company, hypothetically, would you follow the rep or follow the brand? Gerald Kaczmarek didn't even pause. Marcus, I don't buy from Hadley Greer. I buy from you. I've been telling you that for 8 years. Latonia Braz here at Southern Polymer said something similar. Marcus, you're the only vendor rep who's ever asked me about my daughter's volleyball tournament. You think I care what logo is on your business card? One by one, quietly, over the course of months, I had the same conversation with every significant client in the Ohio Valley territory, not asking them to leave, just asking if they'd be open to a conversation, just counting. Meanwhile, I was doing something else nobody knew about. Remember that PMP certification Don laughed at? The one that was supposed to be my fantasy football management degree? Well, I'd kept going. While Don was eating Chick-fil-A and Kyle was ordering Wagyu, I was taking night classes online through Georgia Southern, operations management, supply chain logistics, building a resume that looked nothing like a senior account manager and everything like a regional operations director. I also, and this is the part I'm not sure I should admit, but here we are, made friends with Marguerite Sandoval, the Pittsburgh executive from the Quarterly Review, the one who'd written in her notebook. It started innocently. After that quarterly meeting, she'd emailed me directly to ask a follow-up question about one of the retention metrics. Professional. Routine. But I answered it thoroughly, with data, and I CC'd nobody. She responded. We started a correspondence. Nothing inappropriate. Just two professionals discussing operational efficiency at a company that was, let's be honest, running on Don Hadley's ego and my elbow grease. Marguerite was a senior VP of operations at Greer Whitfield, the parent company. 54, sharp, the kind of person who wore reading glasses on a chain and still managed to look like she could fire you through a wall. She'd been with the parent company for 19 years, and she was very quietly assembling a case for restructuring the Southeast regional leadership. I didn't know that at first. I found out in October 2023 when she called me directly and said, Marcus, I'm going to ask you a question, and I need you to answer it honestly, not loyally. Okay? How much of the Ohio Valley revenue is Don Hadley? I could have been diplomatic. I could have been the worker bee. Instead, I said, 0. Don hasn't closed a new account since 2016. He manages. I sell. Long pause. That's what I thought. Can you send me your personal performance data? Not from the company system. Whatever you've been tracking on your own. My spreadsheet. My beautiful, obsessive 11-year spreadsheet. The one I kept on my personal Dell laptop. Column A, column B, column C. I sent it that night from my personal email, encrypted, because I am a counter, and counters are careful. What Marguerite told me next changed everything. Greer Whitfield was planning a regional restructure. They were creating a new position, Southeast Regional Director. It would oversee the Columbus, Savannah, Louisville, and Charlotte offices. It was, effectively, Don Hadley's job, but elevated, modernized, and reporting directly to Pittsburgh instead of through the old good old boy chain. The posting goes internal in January, Marguerite said. I can't promise anything, but I can tell you that your spreadsheet is the most detailed performance record I've ever seen from a mid-level employee. And I can tell you that the parent company is very interested in people who build revenue from the ground up rather than inherit it. January. That was 3 months away. I could wait 3 months. I'd waited 11 years for a promise that was never coming. 3 months was nothing. But I had to be smart. I couldn't let Don suspect anything. So I did the hardest thing I've ever done in my professional life. I kept smiling. I kept showing up. I kept showing Kyle how the CRM worked. I kept letting Don call me Bud and pat me on the back too hard and take credit in meetings. I kept being the quiet man in the loud room, and I kept counting. Christmas 2023 was interesting. The company holiday party was at a steakhouse in downtown Columbus, not the one Kyle had taken Gerald to, a different one, equally overpriced. Don gave a speech. He stood at the head of a long table with a glass of Woodford Reserve in his hand and said, "This year, we grew as a family, and I want to raise a glass to everyone who made that possible, especially my son Kyle, who hit the ground running and has already made his mark on this company." Kyle's mark on the company at that point consisted of a negative $14,000 net impact when you factored in his salary, his expense reports, and the 2 clients who'd reduced their orders because they were annoyed at being handed off to someone who didn't know the difference between a flange gasket and a flat washer. I raised my glass. I smiled. I ate my $38 filet mignon and made small talk with Renata from payroll, who was wearing a sparkly red sweater and eating dinner rolls like they owed her money. Renata, God bless her, leaned over and whispered, "Don submitted the paperwork to make Kyle's salary $78,000, base, plus full commission eligibility on your old accounts." $78,000. Kyle Hadley, who had been at the company for 9 months and had personally closed exactly one deal, a $4,200 order for safety goggles that he'd actually priced wrong, costing the company $600 in margin, was making $78,000. My base was $61,000. After 11 years, I ate another bite of steak. "Thanks, Renata. You okay, Marcus?" "I'm counting." She gave me a look, but she didn't ask. January came. The internal posting went live on a Tuesday, the 9th. Southeast Regional Director. Salary range, $135,000 to $165,000 plus performance bonus. Required, minimum 10 years industry experience, demonstrated revenue growth, PMP or equivalent credential preferred. PMP or equivalent credential preferred. I applied that night, from my personal laptop. At my kitchen table, eating leftover jambalaya from a Tupperware container, with my cat Herschel sitting on the chair next to me like a furry, judgmental witness. Don didn't know about the posting. Or rather, Don didn't know it was coming for him. The restructure meant his VP of sales role was being absorbed into the new regional director position. Whoever got the new job would effectively be Don's replacement and his supervisor simultaneously. Greer Whitfield wasn't firing Don. They were going to offer him a lateral move to senior advisor, a title that came with an office but no authority, no direct reports, and no commission override. And here is where it gets beautiful in a way I almost feel guilty about. Almost. The interview process had 3 rounds: phone screen with HR, video interview with the Pittsburgh leadership team, and an in-person final with Marguerite and 2 other SVPs. For the phone screen, I drove to Tybee Island and sat in Uncle Clyde's driveway. He made me sweet tea and sat on the porch while I took the call in my car, and when I came out, he said, "Well, they want a second interview." He nodded, took a sip of tea. "Remember, Marcus, quiet man, loud room." "Yes, sir. Go get 'em." Round 2 was a video call from my apartment. Herschel tried to walk across my keyboard twice. I gave a 20-minute presentation on regional growth strategy using real data from my spreadsheet, anonymized but real. I talked about client relationship architecture. I talked about the difference between inherited revenue and built revenue. I used the phrase organic pipeline development and watched 3 executives nod simultaneously. Round 3 was in Pittsburgh. I flew up on a Wednesday in February, wearing a suit I bought at Nordstrom Rack for $189. Charcoal gray, slim fit, the nicest thing I'd owned since my college graduation. Marguerite met me in the lobby. She was wearing her reading glasses on the chain. She looked at me and said, "You ready?" "I've been ready for about a decade." She almost smiled. "Good answer." The interview lasted 90 minutes. I brought a binder, not a fancy one, a plain black 3-ring binder from Office Depot, $4.99. Inside was my spreadsheet, printed and tabbed, revenue growth by year, client retention by quarter, Every account I'd built, every relationship I'd maintained, every dollar I'd generated for a company that had rewarded me with a title that hadn't changed since 2018 and a boss who called me a worker bee. The SVP of Human Resources, a man named Corbin Ose, looked through the binder for a long time. Then he looked up and said, "Mr. Devlin, I have one question. Why didn't you leave years ago?" And I said something I'd been thinking about for months. Because I thought loyalty was a two-way street. I was wrong about that, but I wasn't wrong about the work. The work was always real. I'd like the chance to prove that the leadership can be real too. Corbin closed the binder. Marguerite took off her reading glasses. The third SVP, a woman named Deirdre Palazzo, who hadn't said much, leaned forward and said, "When can you start?" I got the call on March 1st, 2024, exactly 1 year after Don had announced Kyle's hiring. The universe has a dark sense of humor, and I respect it for that. Marguerite called me personally. "Marcus, I'm pleased to offer you the position of Southeast Regional Director. Your starting salary will be $158,000, plus a performance bonus structure tied to regional growth metrics. You'll oversee all 4 offices, including Columbus and Savannah. You'll report directly to me." I was sitting in my car in the Panera parking lot, chicken Caesar salad on the passenger seat. I looked at it and thought, this is the last sad parking lot lunch of my life. "I accept." "Good. We'll announce the restructure company-wide on March 15th. Until then, this is confidential. Restructure. You understand?" "Yes, ma'am." "And Marcus? The Columbus office will require some personnel adjustments. I trust your judgment on that." "Completely." Personnel adjustments. She said it so cleanly, like pruning a hedge. I drove to Tybee Island that afternoon. Uncle Clyde was on the porch. I didn't even have to say anything. He looked at my face and said, "You got it." I got it. He stood up, slowly, because his knees are what they are, and he hugged me. My Uncle Clyde is not a hugger. He's a handshake and a nod man. But he hugged me, and he said into my shoulder, "Your mama would be real proud, son." My mother died in 2019. Breast cancer. She never saw the promotion I was promised. She never saw me get what I earned. But she saw me work for it, and I think that counts. The 2 weeks between accepting the position and the company-wide announcement were the strangest of my life. I went to work every day, sat at my desk, answered Kyle's questions about the CRM system, listened to Don tell a client on speakerphone, "My team is the best in the business." His team, his business, my work. I ate lunch in the break room, washed my Hadley Greer mug, and I knew that in 14 days, the man who called me a worker bee would learn that the bee had become the beekeeper, and his son, the prince who'd been handed a kingdom he didn't build, would learn that the kingdom had a new king. March 15th, Friday, 9 a.m. The all-hands meeting was scheduled in the main conference room. Same fluorescent lights, same stale donuts, though someone had sprung for Duncan this time, which felt vaguely ominous. Greer Whitfield had sent Marguerite and Corbin Ose from Pittsburgh. Their presence alone made people nervous. You could feel it in the room, the way people held their coffee cups a little tighter, the way conversations died mid-sentence. Don was in the front row. He was wearing his navy blazer with the brass buttons. He had no idea what was about to happen. He thought this was a routine corporate visit. He'd even prepared a slide deck. I know because he'd asked me to proofread it the day before. I did. I corrected 2 typos and a revenue figure he'd inflated by $40,000. I handed it back with a smile. "Thanks, bud," he'd said. "What would I do without you?" Marguerite stood at the front of the room. She was calm, professional. She explained that Greer Whitfield was implementing a regional restructure to modernize leadership and align operational oversight with revenue generation. Don was nodding along. Kyle, sitting 2 seats down from his father, was on his phone under the table. "Effective April 1st, Marguerite said, the Southeast region will be overseen by a new regional director who will report directly to the Pittsburgh executive team. This position will replace the current regional VP of sales role." Don stopped nodding. After a thorough national search and internal review, we're pleased to announce that the new Southeast Regional Director will be Marcus Devlin. The room went silent. Not quiet. Silent. The kind of silence that has weight. I stood up from my chair in the third row. I'd worn the Nordstrom rack suit, charcoal gray. I buttoned the jacket as I stood, which is a small thing, but it felt enormous. Don turned around in his seat. His face went through about 6 expressions in 3 seconds: confusion, disbelief, calculation, anger, forced smile, and then something I'd never seen on Don Hadley's face before: fear. Kyle looked up from his phone. Marguerite continued. She explained the new reporting structure. She explained that Don would be offered a lateral role as senior advisor, a position that leverages your institutional knowledge, she said, which is corporate for, we're putting you in a closet with a window. She explained that all personnel decisions within the Southeast region would fall under the regional director's authority. My authority. After the meeting, people filed out in that stunned, shuffling way humans do when the ground shifts beneath them. Don didn't move from his chair for a full minute. Kyle walked up to me in the hallway. "Marcus, congratulations, man." He said it like he meant it, which was the strangest part. Kyle wasn't a bad person. He was a 24-year-old who'd been handed opportunities by a father who confused inheritance with merit. He shook my hand. His palm was sweating. "Thanks, Kyle. So, what does this mean for my role?" I looked at him. This kid who'd been given my clients, my territory, my revenue, my title, this kid who'd called me support and didn't know a flange from a flat washer, was asking me what happened next. "We'll talk Monday," I said. 5 words. That was my exit from the moment I'd waited 14 months for. 5 words and a handshake and a walk down the hallway to a parking lot where my Honda Accord sat in the same spot it always sat, next to the dumpster, because the good spots were reserved for VPs. Not anymore. Don caught me in the parking lot. He was moving fast for a 61-year-old. His blazer was unbuttoned. His face was the color of raw salmon. Marcus, wait." I stopped, turned around. "What the hell is this? Did you go behind my back? After everything I've done for you?" I let that sentence hang in the Georgia air for about 5 seconds. Everything he'd done for me. The stolen accounts, the stolen credit, the commission restructuring, the grunt stuff, the worker bee. "Don, I didn't go behind your back. I applied for an open position and I got it. That's how this works. This is my region. I built this. You didn't build it, Don. You inherited it from Hank Wexler in 2009, and I grew it by $1.9 million over the next decade. It's in the spreadsheet. Would you like to see the spreadsheet?" His mouth opened, closed, opened again. He looked like a fish that had just realized the bowl was empty. "We're all family here," I said. A fish. And I let just enough silence sit between us that he could hear his own words coming back to him from a different mouth. "I'll see you Monday." I got in my Accord, drove to Panera, ordered a chicken Caesar salad, ate it inside this time, at a table, by the window. Within 2 weeks, Don took the senior advisor role because the alternative was a severance package and a non-compete clause. His corner office was reassigned. He got a smaller office near the supply closet. The framed photo of him with the governor stayed on the wall of the old office because nobody bothered to take it down, which was somehow worse than if they'd thrown it away. Within a month, 3 of Don's remaining allies at the company, mid-level managers who'd ridden his coattails for years, were reassigned to roles that matched their actual output. One of them, a guy named Bryce who'd spent most of 2023 forwarding Don's emails and calling it executive support, was offered a position in the Louisville warehouse. He quit. Nobody noticed. Kyle I handled differently. I called him into my office now, the one with the window and the bulldog paperweight, which I put in a drawer, and I was honest with him. "Kyle, you're not ready for this territory. You know it. I know it. But that's not your fault. Your father put you in a position you weren't prepared for, and he did it for his own reasons, not yours." Kyle stared at the desk. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "He told me you were okay with it. He said you wanted to move into more of an advisory role. Of course he did. I didn't, I said. But here's what I'll offer you. There's a junior account development position in the Charlotte office. Entry level. Real training program. If you're willing to start from the ground floor and actually learn this business, I'll give you that chance. But the Ohio Valley accounts are mine. They always were. Kyle took the Charlotte job. He started in April. Last I heard, he was doing okay. Not great, but okay. Learning. Humbled. Which is more than his father ever managed. Gail Hadley, Don's wife, called me once. She was polite, in that southern way that's polite the way a knife is shiny. She said, "I hope you're proud of yourself, Marcus." I said, "Yes, ma'am, I am. Have a good evening." Don lasted 4 months as senior advisor. He resigned in August. The official story was retirement. The real story was that sitting in a small office near the supply closet while the man he'd called a worker bee ran, the region was a kind of daily humiliation that Don Hadley's ego simply could not metabolize. I heard he's consulting now. Independent strategic advisory. Which, in my experience, means he has business cards and a LinkedIn profile and nothing else. Last month, I drove to Tybee Island on a Sunday. Uncle Clyde was on the porch. Sweet tea. Mason jar. The shrimp boats were coming in, their lights looking like low stars on the water. Herschel the cat was in the passenger seat because he likes car rides, which is unusual for a cat but entirely on brand for my life, which has never followed the expected script. I sat down next to Clyde. He handed me a glass. "How's the new job?" "Good. Busy. I'm hiring 2 new reps for the Savannah office next month, building the team the way it should have been built from the start. Your mama would like that. She always said you'd be the boss someday. She also said I was too nice for my own good. She wasn't wrong about that either." We sat there for a while. The salt air was warm and the sky was turning that particular shade of violet that only happens on the Georgia coast in September, when the humidity finally breaks and the world exhales. "Uncle Clyde." "Yeah." The quiet man in the loud room. He wasn't just counting, was he? Clyde took a sip of tea, smiled. "No, sir. He was counting the exits before he sat down, and then he was counting the chairs. And then he was figuring out which one was his." I thought about that. About 11 years of counting. About a spreadsheet on a Dell laptop and a Panera parking lot and a granola bar and a Honda Accord and a mug that said Hadley Greer that I'd finally stopped washing. I bought a new mug last week. It's plain white. Says nothing on it. But when I drink coffee from it at my desk in my office with a window that overlooks the river, it tastes like something I can't quite name. Freedom, maybe. Or patience finally paying its dividend. Or maybe it just tastes like coffee. That's fine too. I've learned to appreciate the simple things. The quiet things. The things you build with your own hands, one client at a time,